Great to see everybody this morning. Just before class, I put a new sheet on the back table for next Sunday's study in the book of Daniel. That will cover chapter 11. So if you want to grab a copy of that, either now or after class, it's just the two fresh pages on the back table. But we are in chapter 10 of Daniel today. And if you need a copy of those notes, there's a few extra copies in the back for chapter 10. So we have the two sets of notes. One is the actual text with some room for just note-taking, and then the other are the discussion questions that we use to go through the chapter. So let's turn our Bibles to chapter 10 of Daniel. Daniel chapter 10. Daniel chapter 10. I will remind you, chapter 10, 11, 12, we're going to be done here in a few weeks. If you have any suggestions of what you want to study next, I'm all ears. If you don't offer some suggestions, I'll pick something, or the elders may have a recommendation. But we're drawing close to the end of our study of the book of Daniel, so we've got about another 3 or 4 weeks left, depending on how long it takes us to get through chapter 11. Chapter 11 is a pretty beefy chapter. It's got a lot going on. There's a lot of verses to it. So 3 or 4 weeks, and we're going to be out of Daniel into something else. And on Sunday mornings, we like to stay textual. We do sort of a topical on Sunday or Wednesday evening. If you have a suggestion for a book of the Bible to study, it can be Old or New Testament, let me know. I'd be glad to hear what you have to say about that. If there's something you've really wanted to dig into. And that's how the Daniel study started. We had some couple people say, let's do a prophet book. Let's do something like Daniel. So we've had a great study in Daniel so far. Okay, so we have a couple of discussion questions this morning. We use our discussion questions to kind of get us into the text. And we sort of block it off. Each discussion question covers a certain segment of the text, or at least something going on in the chapter. And you may have noticed it's not an incredibly long chapter comparatively to some others. But we are in a section of the book since chapter 7 that we've turned the corner, and we are in a notably figurative section of the book. We're dealing with visions. We have a lot of symbols. And if you'll notice in the bulletin, we tried to put some complement in the bulletin of what we're doing. There's some tips on reading apocalyptic literature. We have it this week, and the bulletin for next week, there's going to be some tips on how to read sections of the Bible like this, because they are more difficult. They're not impossible, but a little more difficult to understand. Okay, so here's the first question. This is more of to get us into what's going on in the last couple of chapters. Question number 1 is this. As part of our examination of this chapter, read chapters 11 and 12. So the goal in the first question was to read chapter 10, chapter 11, and chapter 12. Read that all together. And as you read these 3 chapters, does chapter 10 go with the remaining 2? Right? Does it sort of stand alone, or is it part of the last 3 chapters? And what do you think is the purpose of chapter 10? There seems to be a purpose in mind here. And I say that in connection to the last 2 chapters. I don't know if you read all 3. Where do you think chapter 10 fits in the overall scheme? Joel?
I think chapter 10 introduces you to 11 and 12.
I think so.
Because 11 and 12 would just be out of the blue unless you had 10 saying, here's what's going to happen. I think it's an introduction.
Yeah, I definitely think that. If you didn't hear Joel, he was saying chapter 10 probably serves like an introduction to the remaining 2 chapters, and I completely agree with that. I don't know that there's, going into chapter 11 without chapter 10, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. I don't know that anybody would have an alternate opinion on that, but it seems like it goes with the group and sort of leads us into that, Art. That's it. And I was going to make that point. I'm glad you brought that up. The chapter divisions in the Bible, are they placed there by the inspired writers, or did someone come along later and put chapter divisions there? They're not inspired, these chapter divisions. And I think sometimes in the Bible we when we see a chapter division, it does a disservice to us because in our mind we shut off what was in the previous chapter and then we sort of start again in a new chapter when the truth is they may actually go together. And so there's a need to read continuously, especially in chapters where there should not be a chapter division. And I think this is probably one of those where chapters 10, 11, and 12 probably shouldn't have a chapter division. They just need to stand alone as the last prophecy of Daniel in the book of Daniel, because you sort of have in chapter 10 an introduction, and then you've got the real body of the vision in chapter 11, and chapter 12 sort of serves as a conclusion to what he just said in chapter 11 that he introduced in chapter 10. So I think sometimes we're done a disservice by reading the end of the chapter and we say, okay, there's the end of the thought, and then we just sort of pick back up. Just thinking out loud, let me illustrate what I'm talking about. Go to Matthew chapter 9. It has nothing to do with Daniel, but let's just illustrate. Let's illustrate what we're about to see in chapter 10, 11, and 12. Matthew chapter 9, just thinking out loud. Go to the end of Matthew chapter 9. Verse 35, it says, Jesus went about all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues, preaching the gospel of the kingdom, healing every sickness and every disease among the people. He saw the multitudes. He was moved with compassion for them because they were weary, scattered like sheep having no shepherd. He said to his disciples, the harvest truly is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore pray the Lord of harvest that he send out laborers into his harvest. Now he's talking about solving the problem of getting his message to the people. Look at chapter 10. Look at verse 1. Do you think that goes with what he's just talked about in chapter 9? In fact, what's the first word? And when he had called his 12 disciples, what's he commissioned his disciples to do? Go out into the harvest, and reap the harvest. And so this is just one of many examples. This is the one that just popped into my head, but it's an example of how that chapter divisions don't always do us a service. Sometimes they do us a disservice, and I think that is the case in Daniel chapter 10. I think what we have is the introduction to the three chapters that basically serve as Daniel's last prophecy in the book. So we've had several, and this is the last, and probably the most extensive of the prophecies coming in chapter 11. So with that said, let's move to question 2, and this starts to get us into the text a little bit. Number 2, even though Daniel's visions have outlined world history and the development of nations, what's the real emphasis? And if you read the chapter and you're looking at what's going on and you're looking at it carefully, sort of you're moving behind some of the details that are mentioned here, where has God's focus always been in these proclamations? That is, the proclamations of the prophets. Is there a larger reason for what he's doing? Are we supposed to see the bigger picture behind what God is mentioning here? What did you see in this chapter and the chapters that follow? What's he really focused on?
Christ.
Yes. Have we ever lost sight, since the beginning of the Bible, have we ever lost sight of the Messiah? Remember, we did Scheme of Redemption study back a couple of months ago. We finished it up, and we spent a lot of time looking at how God developed the seed line through history. And is God just sort of randomly, is he just writing a history book here, or is it connected in some way to redemption? Yeah, whatever he's doing is connected redemptively to Jesus Christ. There'd be no reason for just the conveying of historical information, except it's a part of the redemption story. It's part of the inspired record. Now, in verse 1, he says, in the 3rd year of Cyrus, the king of Persia. So now, Cyrus has been reigning now for 3 years, the 3rd year of Cyrus, and obviously we've talked about that back in Isaiah 45. Over 150 years before Cyrus was on the scene of history, God prophesied by name through Isaiah that Cyrus would let the people go. And then we've already seen some of the history, Ezra chapter 1, verses 1 through 3, where God specifically records that Cyrus did what God said he would do almost 200 years prior, which is to release the people back into Jerusalem. This raises an interesting question, though. Why didn't Daniel go back? I mean, this is 3 years now after the proclamation of Cyrus. Why didn't Daniel go back? Any Any thoughts on why he hasn't returned back to Jerusalem at this point? I don't know if you've thought about that. I was just mulling that over this week. Any thoughts as to why you think he may not have gone back? Yeah, Tom?
Too old and too embedded in his situation.
Okay, and I think both of those are valid, because at this point we've looked sort of at the chronology. You know, when Cyrus comes on the scene of history, and by the time now the third year of his reign, Daniel, what's a guesstimate on his age here? I mean, late 80s or maybe even his early 90s by this point. I mean, he's an older fellow, so the trip itself would have been hard. But I think what Tom said too was he was very deeply embedded in a position of influence in the Persian Empire. And God was certainly still working through Daniel to that end. And honestly, what kind of effort was taking place back in Jerusalem? What were they going to start doing back in Jerusalem? You think his efforts as a 90-year-old man were better served in a position of influence in a Persian kingdom or picking up a hammer back in Jerusalem? It's probably better served where he's at. So I don't know that we know the real reason, but maybe some of those go into it. But he's still under Persian control back in the area where he was. So he does not go back. And in verse 1 it says, obviously we're reminded his name was Belteshazzar. And it says the message is true, but the appointed time was long. And if you have good marginal notes, under verse 1 it will say, or, and of great conflict. And there has been a lot of debate over the translation of that term, and a lot of translations now will indicate that instead of the thing that was mentioned or the message that was mentioned, a better translation may be the great conflict. In other words, he's being shown a great conflict that is, well, it's already sort of brewing, but it's about to take place, and we're going to see that, especially in chapter 11. We're going to see some of that. You see it a little bit in chapter 10. But a lot of this has to do with Persia and Greece, because if we go over, we'll get to it in a minute, but look at verse 13 right now. The prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days, and behold, Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help, for I had been left alone there with the kings of Persia. So it mentions the Persian Empire. We know we're still within that context, and now Daniel's being given a glimpse of whatever was happening historically, probably between Persia and Greece. And we'll talk about that again in just a little bit. But the point is, and I think Gene brought it out and several echoed the sentiment, these are still all events that were affecting the people of God. Right? And so it's easy to get caught up historically and just look at what's going on historically at Persians and Medes and Grecians and Romans coming in later, but you still have the people of God involved in that. And if you go back to Genesis, right, you've got chapter 12, God says to Abraham, through you all the families of the earth are going to be blessed. And then it gets narrowed all the way through the book of Genesis. And finally, in chapter 49, he says to Judah, the scepter will not depart from Judah. It's, the Christ is coming through you. And in back of all of this are still the people through whom the Lord is coming. So this history affected the people of God, and not only the people, but also the land where the Lord would come and do his work. And look at, if you would just want to hold your place real quick, go to Galatians chapter 4. Galatians chapter 4. I think every time you run into a section where you have some history and we're not quite sure where it fits, it all fits under this context, Galatians 4. Look at verse 4, Galatians 4, verse 4. When the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, that we might receive the adoption of sons. When it says the fullness of time, what's that tell us about history?
All gravitates to one of them.
It all centers around the Lord. And does it tell us, does it at least imply that God had been at work in history to bring about the perfect conditions in which the Messiah would come? So, yeah, it's easy to get caught up in Daniel and say, well, this Persia and Mede stuff, the Grecian stuff, what's all that have to do with anything? In back of it all is the focus on the Messiah. We've never lost sight of that. So as we read chapters 10, 11, and 12, where we start getting into some pretty heavy history, almost point by point of history leading up to some of those events, we still can't lose sight of the fact that all of that falls within the context of redemption. Okay, So the first part of it is pretty easy. Some of it in the last question, we're going to talk about the effect of this on Daniel. So we're going to skip over a couple of verses, like in verse 2 it says he was mourning 3 full weeks. We're going to talk about that. Verse 3 says, I ate no pleasant food, no meat, no wine came into my mouth. I did not anoint myself till 3 whole weeks were fulfilled. We'll talk about the effect at the very end. Right now I want us to look at verse 4. It says, now on the 24th day of the first month, I was by the side of the great river, that is Tigris. I lifted my eyes and looked, and behold, a certain man clothed in linen, whose waist was girded with gold of Uphaz. His body was like beryl, his face like the appearance of lightning, his eyes like torches of fire, his arms and feet like burnished bronze in color, and the sound of his words like the voice of a multitude. And I, Daniel, alone saw the vision, for the men who were with me did not see the vision, but a great terror fell upon them, so that they fled to hide themselves. Therefore I was left alone when I saw this great vision, and no strength remained in me, for my vigor was turned to frailty in me, and I retained no strength. Yet I heard the sound of his words, and while I heard the sound of his words, I was in deep sleep on my face with my face to the ground. So here's question number 3. And this almost requires reading the rest of the chapter to sort of distinguish between some of the characters here. But question number 3 is this. Considering the imagery connected to this majestic person, who do you think is being described, especially in verses 4, 5, and 6? That's the bulk of the descriptions there, but you have some of what happened to Daniel in the aftermath of it. Who do you think is being described? Okay. Yeah, okay, so we're going to look at some comparative passages, I think so. Anybody else get anything different, Joel?
Well, you know, the word vision is used 6 or 7 times in chapter 10.
Yep.
And I'm trying to separate that. You know, Paul was going to the third heaven, whether in the spirit or not, you know, everything. This is a vision he saw. Okay, now, I first thought it was God. Then God says, you cannot see my face, for no man shall see my face. And you know, John repeats that. 1 John repeats that. So you're not seeing God, but now Christ, it looks like this is foretelling come to Christ, because as
Yep.
it said, the same description
Yes.
is used in Revelation.
Yes, and I think Joel and Gene both have brought out that there are some passages where it's so obvious, some of the descriptions, it's kind of hard to dismiss that. So let me just go over what has been historically presented as some of the options for this. Now, the first of these, when I offer it, you're going to go, huh? How do people get that? But there are some commentators who say this is actually a description of King Cyrus of Persia. That sounds kind of weird, right? Because these descriptions certainly don't fit Cyrus of Persia. When you look at the actual description, when it's clothed in linen, a representation of purity, Cyrus was not a pure man. The gold Uphaz girdle, perhaps an emphasis on the importance and the worth, you know, being the gold, the prominence of that. The body like beryl, which is like yellow sapphire, which is usually associated with royalty, so maybe that could be used of Cyrus. A face like the appearance of lightning, which is an emphasis on truth. Eyes like torches of fire. Judgment, and then you have 2 symbols of power, arms and feet like burnished bronze, and then the sound of his words was like the voice of a multitude, both of those emphasizing the power, his authority and his power in both of those. But that doesn't really sound like Cyrus, because I understand, like Joel just mentioned, it is a vision, and so it's possible that people could be figuratively described in a vision, and Cyrus was certainly an agent of justice for God, but to say that Cyrus was, well, I guess maybe some people could say he was sort of a type of a savior. He certainly didn't have the qualities of that, but looking at the qualities that are figuratively portrayed, it just doesn't really fit Cyrus. And this, whoever's speaking comes with authority from heaven, so this is not, it doesn't seem to be Cyrus. So here are the 2 remaining options. And I think if you talk to enough brethren, you're probably going to find that brethren probably fall between one or the other. One strong belief here is that this is an angelic being. That is a pretty firmly held belief by some people. And they would say it's probably some major angel, perhaps like Gabriel or Michael. I will say, if it was one between the two, it probably would not be Michael, because if you go over to same chapter in verse 13, who is mentioned by name in verse 13? Michael is, but Michael is actually assisting whoever's back in verses 4, 5, and 6. So it wouldn't be Michael, it would be someone other than that. So a lot of people say this is probably Gabriel under consideration, or some angel. Now, just a question. Are angels described sometimes as mighty angels in the Bible? Are they described that way? Revelation 15:6, sometimes they're called mighty angels. Revelation 10, verse 1, sometimes they're called mighty angels. Do we sometimes see angels in figurative descriptions with golden girdles? Look at Revelation 15. I want to be fair with what's presented, but I agree with Joel. I also agree with Gene. I think this is somebody different. Look at Revelation chapter 15. Revelation chapter 15. Drop down with me to verse 6 of Revelation chapter 15. Out of the temple came the 7 angels having 7 plagues, clothed in pure bright linen. Is back in chapter 10, whatever's under consideration. Was it clothed in linen? Okay. Having their chests girded with golden bands. So do you see in the Bible a description of an angelic being, and here they're called angels in Revelation 15:6, with linen apparel and golden belts? I mean, it's said. So I could understand why somebody would say maybe it's an angel, because you have that description. And I understand you're dealing with figurative language. So and as long as we're not changing the doctrine of the Lord, I don't think it's a fellowship issue. But there's some who are really convinced that this is an angel. However, when it's mentioned here, the linen and the gold and the beryl and the lightning face and the torches of fire and the arms like burnished bronze and the sound of his words like the voice of a multitude, all of those together sound more fitting of somebody within the Godhead versus an angel. And we have some descriptions that I think parallel each other, and we know at least in one of those we're talking about the Lord. So here's this description. Gene mentioned it, Joel also mentioned it too. Let's look at Revelation chapter 1. Look at Revelation chapter 1, and let's see if the language, it's not identical, but let's see if the language is also fitting of a member of the Godhead. Look at Revelation chapter 1. And then I'm going to offer what would be the objection to the view that this could be a member of the Godhead. There's actually 2 concerns here. Revelation chapter 1. So go down with me to verse 13. In the midst of the 7 lampstands, one like the Son of Man, clothed with a garment down to the feet and girded about the chest with a golden band. So would this also, in Daniel, would this also fit the Lord? Yes, okay. His head and his hair were white like wool, white as snow. His eyes were like a flame of fire. Do you see some comparisons between Revelation 1 description of Jesus and Daniel 10, okay? His feet were like fine brass. You kind of have some similarities there. As if refined in a furnace, and his voice as the sound of many waters. Does that seem to sort of line up with what we have in Daniel chapter 10? And of course, he has the stars in his right hand. Out of his mouth a sharp 2-edged sword. His countenance was like the sun shining in its strength. So if we look at the description, I don't know, it almost sounds like it's more description of somebody within the Godhead versus an angel. I can see how somebody might think that it's an angel, but if we're going to distinguish whatever Michael and his group are doing in verse 13, then maybe this is somebody different. And I tend to think with some here that this is probably a description of what would some call the pre-incarnate Christ or the Messiah. It's one of the members of the Godhead that's being described here. Now, that's not without objection. One of the objections is, look at verse 11. Whoever this is talking, and in verse 11 it says, O Daniel, man greatly beloved, understand the words that I speak to you and stand upright, for now I have been sent to you. So one of the objections would be, whoever this is was dispatched to go talk to Daniel. Well, then if whoever this is was dispatched, how could it be God? Because who dispatches God to do anything? Well, remember that this is visionary, and Was there a time when the Lord himself, when Jesus on earth, said that he had been sent to do the Lord's work? Does it take his divinity away to say that? All right. So just simply accomplishing a role within whatever God's purposes are does not mean that he's been robbed of his authority. It just means that he's fulfilling whatever the Godhead has decided. It doesn't do anything to his authority. So there's no problem with a member of the Godhead carrying out a mission, because all three have. And then in verse 13, whoever this is receives help from Michael, one of the archangels. And it would only be used here in the sense that Michael was charged with a role. It would be the sort of same accommodative sense that whoever it is was sent. And so I think you have some accommodative language being used. I tend to think, and I could be wrong, but I tend to think whoever's being described in verses 5 and 6 is probably the Lord being described here, because it just seems more fitting of the Lord. And then you sort of have a change from that in the remaining verses to some of the activities of the angels involved. But just so you know that there are options out there, and some are probably going to fall on one side or the other. Now, whoever this is, look at verse 13. We're going to drop down. We're going to get to some of the response of Daniel in just a moment, but look what happens. Obviously, he's speaking to Daniel. He tells Daniel not to be afraid in verse 12, and then this comes in verse 13. But the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days, and behold, Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, for I had been left alone there with the kings of Persia. When it says in verse 13, the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me, and you have this contradiction and sort of this conflict between Michael and one of the princes here, did you do any thought on who that could be or what that could be? What do you think about the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstanding Michael? Who do you identify that as, or who do you think that could be? What is a possibility here? Let's start with Michael. Do we know anything about Michael? Who's Michael? He's an archangel. He's one of the archangels. And so if you've got a prince who's contradicting Michael, and look at what Michael is called, one of the chief, what? If Michael is a prince, then what may that prince of the kingdom of Persia be? It could be Satan. It could be another angel. I don't know a whole lot about this passage, but I do know that perhaps what is in mind here is some sort of an angelic being who was standing on the other side of this spiritual battle with Michael. And we sort of have, not to this context, but we have hints of the same in Scripture, like Ephesians 6:12. You know, we have that whole passage about the armor of God, right? The panoply of God. And Paul says we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against who? Principalities and powers and spiritual wickedness in high places. And so he identifies that. In Jude verse 9, right? In Jude verse 9, there was a contradiction, a conflict over the body of Moses. And what in the world that was about, I don't know what that's about. But it was between Michael and who? And the devil. And they were contradicting one another about the body of Moses. And so there was conflict. Look at Revelation 12. Go to Revelation 12. Again, not the same. This is not the same context, but the principle of it is intriguing for sure. Revelation chapter 12. Revelation 12. Look at verse 7. War broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought with the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought. Well, who's the dragon? That's the devil, right? And his angels. But they did not prevail, nor was a place found for them in heaven any longer. So the great dragon was cast out, the serpent of old, called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was cast out to the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. So I know that's Revelation 12 is talking about something entirely different. Maybe there's some connection remotely to what we're talking about. But I think what's being supplied, I'll say this carefully because I don't want it to be sort of this superstitious thing. Whatever's spoken of here falls in the context of prior to 1 Corinthians 13, right? Because the miraculous era is gone. It's out of the picture. But I think it's entirely possible we're being given a rare glimpse of some of the behind-the-scenes things that were happening in redemptive history between the devil and God's agents in history. And I don't know that I understand it all, but if these are angels here, it would indicate that perhaps angelic beings were being used to administrate history in some way or another. But it would also mean that as much as God had angels ministering, and they did in the Old Testament, Hebrews 1 and 2 tells us that they were sort of mediators of an old covenant, it perhaps also means that there were other agents at work in human history as well, on the wrong side of things. And so I don't know, I don't profess to know every bit of that. That's a question I have for somebody who was there and understood it better. If we find Daniel one day, we ask him about it. What did that mean? Because I sure want to know what that means. But I know for a fact in the New Testament, we specifically have demons mentioned in the New Testament. I mean, they're mentioned there, but this perhaps could be a glimpse in the Old Testament that they were just as nefarious in the Old Testament as well. But whatever this was, it wasn't no human will was ever impeded, right? People did what they did. There's always been freedom of choice. But do you have any thoughts on this? This is a passage that every time I read this, I'm curious. I don't know the answer to it, but I'm just curious about it. How involved were they, and to what extent did God allow things like that to happen? I don't know. Any thoughts?
Well, Christ gives a good example about the strong man in
Yeah.
the New Testament.
Yeah,
It says you don't break in,
that's right.
take it unless you bind him first.
Right.
And I think that's a reference to what happened to Satan.
Yeah.
He was bound and cast out.
Right.
That's what we know in
Yeah.
Revelation.
How much, and all of it would have been superintended by God in the sense that the devil tried to unseat the plan of God so many times, but God used his attempts of unseating the plan to keep redemption right on track. He never was foiled by the devil, but you just wonder about some of that. Then in verse 14, it comes right back, and obviously Daniel is very concerned about what he's just seen, because in verse 14 it says, this person says, I've come to make you understand what will happen to your people in the latter days, for the vision refers to many days yet to come. So this had been Daniel's concern since chapter 7. Daniel was very concerned about that, and now he is being answered by this person who is speaking to him. And hopefully we'll have some time to talk about this in just a second, but Daniel's speechless. He doesn't really know quite what to say. At the end of verse 15, my face was toward the ground. I was speechless. Daniel's receiving this. He just has no words. And then in verses 17 through 20, before he leaves, whoever is under consideration wants to confirm with Daniel that he understands, because you get to the end and he says, verse 20, do you know why I've come to you? Do you understand? Are you getting what the vision has been presented to you? Now I must return to fight with the prince of Persia. When I've gone forth, indeed the prince of Greece will come. So we know we're dealing with Persia and Greece conflict. Nobody upholds me against you, verse 21, except Michael, your prince. So we have, sort of a confirmation. Do you understand before I leave? Do you understand what you've been shown? Type of thing. So I think what Joel said at the beginning is true, that this is sort of a precursor to what we're about to see in chapter 11. Sort of the introduction of that. We're getting more of the emotional aspects of Daniel and how this affected him, and then more about the historical side of that in chapter 11. So that brings us to question number 4. And I want to spend the rest of our time here, because I think there's a good point to be made in this chapter about what it was doing to Daniel. Okay, it's easy to overlook that part and look just at the historical part or look at the character part. But number 4 is this. Much of this chapter revolves around the impact of these messages on Daniel. What are some of the effects of this on Daniel, and what are some of the responses that are made to him? So let's look at a few of these. In verse 2, how did this affect Daniel in verse 2? For how long? 3 full weeks. And then if you follow that in verse 3, it tells us that during these 3 weeks, here's what happened. I ate no pleasant food, no meat, no wine came to me. So he wasn't eating or drinking regularly, right? He didn't anoint himself at this time. There would be, activities during the Passover. He was not partaking of these things. He sort of shut down for 3 full weeks. Why did his body do that?
He was worried, sick, yearly to death.
Does the body sometimes follow the mind? It does that quite a lot, right? The body follows the mind. And if the mind is very troubled, and we've all been there, right, for different circumstances. If something is weighing heavily on your mind, does your appetite sometimes it just kind of fades away, doesn't it? Just don't eat regularly, and you're not keeping up what you need regularly. You let things go on the outside because of what's taking place on the inside. And that's definitely happening with Daniel. He was very impacted by these messages. Drop down to verse 8. Verse 8. Therefore I was left alone when I saw this great vision, and no strength remained in me. For my vigor was turned to frailty, and I retained no strength. This is one of those moments that, of course, I know he's in visionary posture, but what happened to the color of his face? It just faded away. He's just sort of faint at the end of all of this. He was very weak. In fact, later in the text, he'll talk about his legs and his hands were just trembling when he saw all of this. Look at verse 10. Suddenly a hand touched me, which made me tremble on my knees and on the palms of my hands. So he's literally shaking. And then in verse 15, when he had spoken such words to me, I turned my face toward the ground and I became speechless. Right? What do you make of all this? What is this telling us? And I think there's probably more than one lesson here, but what is this telling us? What's it tell us? What's it tell us about Daniel? What's it tell us about God? What's it tell us about God's Word? What's it tell us? It's just there for a reason, right? We're not just randomly getting information about Daniel. We're supposed to learn something from it. Art?
One thing I get from it is Daniel's extreme reverence for God. I mean, he just, not just, I think it's great. God, he
Yep.
has extreme reverence.
To the degree that he understood what was going on, in whatever degree he did, because we know there's a passage in the New Testament that said even, sometimes prophets didn't quite get it. Whatever he understood, did he believe what he understood? This is the effect of belief. He really believed it. I mean, he was very committed to that. I think Art presented that very well, that this is evidence of the fact that when God said something, he was definitely committed to what God said because it very much affected him on the inside. He was very impacted by that. Do you think God's Word is meant to be taken seriously? Yes, it's meant to be taken seriously. And so there are things in the Bible that are extremely joyful. They make the heart glad. But there are also very hard things in the Bible. Now, Daniel was getting just a laundry list of hard things about some bad things that were going to happen in history. Of course, there's a brilliant end to it all with the Messiah, but Daniel's getting some pretty hard messages. And today, there are still hard things in the Bible. Like when the Bible tells us that if people do not obey the gospel, they're going to be lost. Should that bother us like it bothered Daniel? Yeah, that's a heavy message. And I think sometimes our lack of impact and lack of effect may be an indication we don't take God as seriously as Daniel was taking God. Joel?
And if you think about Daniel, he was obviously leading a pretty good life.
Yes, he was.
Personally.
Yeah.
But he had a deep concern about his people.
Oh, yes.
And this was what's going to happen to his people at
Yeah.
a later date,
Yeah. And we saw that in his prayer in the last chapter. He was so concerned with what's going to happen to the people of God. Deep affection for God's people. It wasn't just God, but also God's people because, he's sick over it. He's sick over what he now knows is going to happen to the people of God, that they're going to go through, they're not done with trials. They're going to come through the other side. The Messiah is going to happen, but it's not without some pretty treacherous years involved, and so he was very concerned about that. But I think this is the fact that he was so affected by this indicates how much he believed that when God said something, it was true. Even though he hadn't seen it yet, and some of this would happen beyond his years, he knew it was right because God said it. And I think that needs to be our attitude toward the Word of God, which means that there are times when we read the Word of God, and because we believe it so much, there's going to be great joy because of what he says. But there's also some really hard things in Scripture, which ought to motivate us to go out and do our job because he's serious and he's telling the truth. Any other thoughts on that before we end the chapter? Yeah, Gene?
Just imagine being shown the future. I mean, we talk about the awesomeness of God, but to be in his presence in a vision
Yes.
apparently blew Daniel.
And it blew him away. He was just astonished by that. Steve?
That person being sent, there's one example, John 17:3, where in Jesus' prayer, he actually says that God sent
Send him, yes. Yeah, yeah. Great thoughts. Thank you so much for your help. So chapter 11, if you've not read it, I hope you have, but I hope you read it as a group. It's very, very weighty. Obviously, it affected Daniel. So we'll do our best to plug through it. It's very, very historical. It's symbolic, but there's a lot of history involved in it. So do your best to go through and see what you make of it, and we'll discuss it next Sunday and see where we get on chapter 11. A lot of history in chapter 11, and then we'll conclude in chapter 12 and then start a new study. Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.